Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, and we are very fortunate to have Julie O'Sullivan with us this evening from Sensory Moded. Julie is an endorsed mental health occupational therapist who has gained considerable knowledge and practice working in the implementation of sensory modulation and sensory approaches at client, clinicians, and service development level. Julie is a co-director of Sensory Modulation Brisbane. She has co-published in 2018 the Sensory Modulation Resource Manual. She conducts webinars, in-services, and training workshops for mental health districts, not-for-profit organisations, and other health and community services using sensory modulation and the integration of sensory approaches into practice and people's daily lives. So now I'll hand you over to Julie.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to close my windows so I can see the screen a bit more and so that hopefully other people can see it clearly. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me today. What a privilege to talk to you guys. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the individual and collective expertise of those with a living or lived experience of mental health, autism, substance use, and sensory processing differences. So thank you for inviting me today. My colleague who I work with on our shared business, Sensory Modulation Brisbane, and my colleague who I co-wrote the Sensory Modulation Resource Manual with sends her apologies. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, so she's entrusted me with this wonderful task of talking to you guys today. And so what I'm going to focus this presentation on is using sensory strategies to help with different self-care tasks, and we're going to focus on showering or bathing as one of those tasks. So as usual, Carolyn and I always have an ambitious program, but hopefully we'll be able to get through this. In relation to questions, I was fortunate enough to be sent some questions ahead of time, and they're great questions, and I've had an opportunity to reflect on those and have a think about those yesterday. So I've got some responses there to present to you guys after the presentation. If people have more questions and we don't have time, I'm sure I'll be forwarded those questions, and I will do my best to provide responses to people after the presentation. What we're going to focus on in the presentation today is I'm just going to give people just a brief intro to a brief definition about what sensory modulation is, just so we have that consistent understanding. I'm going to talk about a concept which people may have heard about, allostatic load and spoon theory, and I'll explain how that relates, I think, to using different sensory strategies. We'll talk about sensory modulation and trauma experience and some of the connections there. We're then going to talk about how trauma can impact on self-care activities like bathing or showering, with specific focus on the concepts of sensory overload, sensory and trauma triggers, and problematic sensations. And then we're going to identify some different sensory modulation strategies for showering, and we're going to break them up into 3 different sections. And then I'll also be able to point you in the direction of some more resources if you're interested, and we'll address the questions that have been submitted already. So fingers crossed we get through it all. So just as a starting point, just so that everyone has that consistent understanding of what sensory modulation is. So sometimes when people refer to sensory modulation, they're referring to the neurological process. So sensory modulation is, I guess, a component of sensory processing. It's a neurological process that happens within us, in our system, automatically. So it's happening whether we're thinking about it or not. But when occupational therapists mostly talk about sensory modulation, we're probably more referring to the intervention of sensory modulation, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So a nice definition that Carolyn and I have come up with and often use to explain sensory modulation is it's changing how you feel through using your senses. So just to give a really simple example of that, we might have a think about this cute little guy swimming here in this photo. So this little gent is on a camping trip with his family, you know, slept in a tent all night. He woke up in the morning. It was a hot night, so he had a bit of a difficult sleep waking up, so he's feeling a bit tired, a bit grumpy. He's feeling hot. He got up out of his tent and started having some breakfast, and he likes to have, you know, cornflakes and milk, but the milk wasn't as cold as he usually likes it, and you know, by the time he got around to eating the cornflakes, they'd sort of gotten soggy. They weren't crunchy and crisp the way he likes it, so that was really annoying for him, and he just felt a bit grumpy and miserable. And so his family member said, why don't we go and have a swim in the, you know, the lake or the river nearby? So the family kind of got up and went and had a swim. And so as he entered that beautiful cool water, so he had the cool of the water and the sound of the water around him and moving his body in the water and splashing with his family, all that sensory input from that experience helped him shift or change that sort of grumpy, hot, irritated feeling to feeling much more cool and calm and a bit happier in himself. So that's sort of an example of how we can use sensory modulation to change how we feel. The traditional, so the concept of sensory modulation has been around for decades, and traditional literature on sensory modulation has talked about using sensory input to help us calm or alert. And so what Carolyn and I talk a lot about is that we can use sensory modulation for much more than that. We can use sensory input to change how we feel in many more ways than sort of calming and alerting. And so if we sort of go around this neat sort of infographic, so we can use it to help us focus, to help us concentrate or to sort of tune in our attention. We can use it as an alternative to self-harm. So sometimes using a strong or an intense sensation as an alternative to self-injurious actions can be helpful for people. We can use sensory modulation for pleasure. So, you know, a lot of the things that give us joy in life, or, you know, keep us interested, you know, help us feel joy and happiness, have, you know, sensory elements to it. And it's those sensory elements that meet our individual needs. So what gives me joy might be something different to what gives another person's joy. And so it does highlight that, you know, sensory strategies really need to be tailored to the individual and what their needs and preferences are. Sensory modulation can be really helpful for grounding. So when we're feeling a bit sort of separate from ourselves, when we're feeling disconnected or dissociative, sensory input, strong sensory input, or our preferred sensory input can really help us feel more connected to our body and kind of connect that brain and body again, and help in those situations. Very good for anxiety and panic as well. We can use sensory modulation to help us navigate or cope with urges to use certain substances like alcohol or illicit substances, or to sort of cope with urges to smoke. We can use sensory modulation to help us feel safe. So not only physical safety in certain environments, but also, and maybe more of a focus on that psychological or felt safety. So really important for being able to be in an environment to feel safe, and for learning. You know, it's so important, you know, to feel at ease and feel safe for us to be able to learn and take in information. We can use sensory modulation for pain, to help us manage pain signals, to deal with illness symptoms, to deal with grief, and to boost our energy. And then the two other circles right at the top and right at the bottom, we can use sensory modulation to change the sensory demands of different activities that we're doing, and we can use sensory modulation to change the environment. So if we're helping make our sensory needs meet the demands of the activities that we're engaging in and the sensory aspects of the environment, then we're going to feel better and we're going to function better. So when talking about sensory modulation, often we also talk at the same time about a concept of sensory processing. So sensory modulation is, I guess, a component, a part of sensory processing. There's lots of other parts, but there are some really interesting theories around sensory processing differences and how that presents in people. And there's an occupational therapist, Winnie Dunn, who's come up with sort of a sensory profile where there are, she talks about 4 different quadrants of sensory processing, and it explains some of the differences that we see in people with their sensory processing presentations. And so the 4 quadrants that Winnie talks about is sometimes we can be sensory missing or have low registration to sensory input. So that means that we don't notice that sensory input in our environment or in our bodies until that input is really intense, strong or novel. And so I've circled that with yellow because in people with borderline personality disorder, we can see trends of sensory missing or low registration. And that is quite commonly seen in the sensory system called interoception, which is that sensory input that we get from our internal system, so our organs and inside our bodies. So people with borderline personality disorder tend to have be sensory missing for that sensory input. Then another sort of quadrant is referred to as sensory sensitivity to sensory input. So when we experience that, it's like a little bit of sensation, a little bit of sensory input feels like a lot, and it feels like too much. So for BPD, we can see higher levels of sensory sensitivity in a range of different sensory systems, including sensory sensitivity for sound or certain sounds, sensory sensitivity for smell, sensory sensitivity for light touch, just as examples. Then we have the area of sensory avoiding of sensory input. So this is where a little bit of sensory input feels like a lot, and to cope with it, it's avoided. So as a way of managing that sensory sensitivity or that feeling that there's too much sensory input, the person actively tries to avoid that. And so we do see that in BPD as well. And sensory seeking of sensory input. So this is where to feel kind of alive and sort of, good in ourselves, certain sensory input needs to be intense, strong and novel. And so for BPD, we can see that sometimes, or trends in seeking of deep pressure, deep touch input, proprioceptive input, and certain movement or vestibular input. So this is a neat concept that's been introduced over the last few years, this idea of trying to achieve sensory health. And I think it sort of highlights the importance or the role that sensory modulation can play in relation to sensory health. So this is the extent to which there is a fit between a person's sensory needs and capacities, the sensory demands of the activities that they engage in, and the sensory features of the environment. And as I mentioned before, if you've got a good match or a good synchronicity between those 3 things, then you're more likely to be able to achieve sensory health. So I'd really like to just take a few minutes to talk about allostatic load and sensory modulation or sensory input, because I think it's a really useful concept, and it will come in handy for some of the things that we're talking about later in this presentation. So people may have heard of allostasis before. I think its cousin homeostasis is probably known a little bit more, and people are more familiar with that. So where homeostasis is the way our system creates stability in our internal environment. So, for example, you know, our body and our system is working towards stability in, you know, our blood sugar levels, for example. So that's kind of homeostasis. Allostasis is the process of maintaining that stabilization, but by changing the conditions that it's operating under. So another way of, I guess, describing that is that the internal body state modulates, which involves anticipation and adjustment and change. It modulates its energy use in response to various environmental demands. Or another way to describe environmental demands is stress. So sometimes this is also referred to as the body budget. So where allostasis is the process of continuous adjustment, and that the way our system continually adjusts to anticipate and respond to environmental demands or stress. Allostatic load is the cost of this maintaining allostasis. So the cost to our you know, to our system and to our health and well-being. So the bigger the allostatic load that we are navigating, the bigger the cost or the impact on our system. And sometimes that will manifest in things like feeling overstressed, feeling overloaded, you know, burnout, fatigue, and ill health, just to name a few. So there are a lot of different biological markers that can indicate issues with allostatic load. So we've just sort of mentioned them on this infographic here. So that can include, you know, the higher our blood pressure is, potentially, that could be a marker of higher allostatic load. Higher levels of things like lipids and different neurotransmitters, different hormones in our body, high levels of cholesterol and glucose levels, you know, a higher body mass index, a higher waist-hip ratio, higher cortisol levels, and interestingly, not as variable heart rate. So heart rate variability, for people who might not be aware of that concept, is the heart's ability to vary its heart rate depending on the load or the stress that it has. So it can go up quickly to meet a load need, and then it can, once you've dealt with that stress, the heart rate can come back down quickly again. And heart rate variability is, and that having that variability and that quick change from one to the other when needed is a sign of better health. So these are all markers of sort of this concept of allostatic load. So there can be lots of factors impacting on our allostatic load. And we've got a few there. So if people are dealing with sort of persistent pain, that'll increase that load. If they're not eating a good diet, a healthy diet, if they're dealing with chronic or persistent illness, if their emotions are more dysregulated or harder to manage, if they're not getting good sleep, if they're not exercising enough, you know, so their fitness and condition isn't good, or maybe if they're doing too much, you know, too much activity, if they're using substances, if they're feeling unsafe, if they've got high levels of stress. But also there's a number of sensory contributors to allostatic load. So if we have too much sensory input, so too many sounds, too much smell, too much touch, especially if a person has sort of that sensory sensitivity that we talked about earlier, that will contribute to a higher allostatic load. Interestingly too, potentially sensory deprivation could also impact on someone's allostatic load in a negative way as well. So what can we do to help address allostatic load? So obviously, if there's certain health factors and well-being factors that we can address and deal with and change, then obviously that's going to assist with allostatic load. But I guess it's important to be mindful that they're not always very easy to quickly address. So chronic health issues takes time to address. Mental health issues, obviously that's a work in progress to help manage and navigate those. Persistent pain is not easy to quickly address. So a way that we can potentially consider another way of helping address allostatic load is if we do have certain sensory sensitivities, then that if we can address those sensory sensitivities, then we can help reduce allostatic load. And so that's where potentially this theory called the spoon theory can come in handy. So as this infographic indicates, that it's been created to help explain that when people are living with challenging health conditions and high levels of stress, then they can have challenges to managing their day-to-day. And a way to explain that is by indicating that when we think about our energy levels for a day, we have a certain number of spoons that we have allocated. And navigating health and well-being issues, including mental health issues and chronic health issues, can take up more spoons because it uses up more of our resources to navigate those things. So that in itself means you've got less spoons per day to then be able to get through and deal with all the activities and tasks that you need to do. So a way then to try not to use up all your spoons or use up your spoons for the next day, which can lead to ongoing fatigue and burnout, is to think about how many spoons it takes to do the different tasks that you need to get done in your day. Are there ways of conserving spoons? So changing how we do our tasks to conserve our energy. We know that sensory sensitivities use more spoons, and so therefore, if we can engage in activities minus or taking away some of that sensory input that we're sensitive to, that in itself can use less spoons. And so this is a concept that this can come in handy in some of our later slides when we look at strategies. So just another way of explaining this. So sensations can use too many spoons. So we can maybe look at or consider how we could change tasks to create sensory ease. So take away some of that sensory input that we're sensitive to, and in doing that, we could save spoons for the rest of the day. So as an example, and that you can probably think of lots of different examples, but as an example, let's think about showering. For some people who are really sensory sensitive to the feeling of water, so for some people that pressure can feel really intense, can feel like little nails going into their skin, or they might find other sensory input related to showering is really, really aversive or difficult to manage as well. So because of that, having a shower uses up 5 spoons. Whereas if there's maybe times where a person could bathe but in a different way, like have a bucket bath, for example, that has less of that sensory input that person's system finds really difficult to manage. Maybe the process can not only be less difficult, it might actually feel a bit more soothing as well. And so compared to the 5 spoons that a shower might use up, a bucket bath might only use 1 spoon. So some people might say to this concept, doesn't that just, if we're looking at conserving spoons or changing how we do certain tasks, certain self-care tasks, for example, doesn't that just encourage people to avoid things? And so Carolyn and I would respond to that in a few different ways. Firstly, we would say, well, being able to avoid certain sort of sensory input can actually improve our functioning. If the end result is the same, if we use a different approach, but the end result is that we get clean at the end, then isn't that sort of helping us improve functioning, because we're doing that rather than avoiding a shower or avoiding bathing in its entirety? So that's sort of something to have a think about. Sometimes a bit of being able to change how we do things and, I guess, avoid sensory input that we find really distressing can result in feeling less stressed, feeling less anxiety, feeling less fear. And so when we're turning down those emotions, then it can be easier potentially to address that anxiety and that fear at a later date, especially if we do it in a sort of a stepped sort of approach. And look, I guess another thing to think about is, does everyone want to desensitize? Do we have to desensitize or use exposure for every single issue? Sometimes we do, but sometimes that might not really be the most valuable and effective use of our time and resources. Another thing to consider is that if a person's difficulty with that task, like a self-care task like bathing or showering, is due to sensory factors, it can actually be really hard and a very long journey to desensitize. So what the literature does indicate to us is when people have heightened sensory sensitivity for certain sensory input, if they're sensory sensitive and they're avoidant, repeated exposure to that input doesn't necessarily turn down or help a person desensitize to that sensory input. It doesn't turn it down for them. That person is just repeatedly tolerating sensory input that they find really difficult and upsetting potentially, because it's not their irrational thoughts that are causing their anxiety. It's the sensory input that they're finding too much, too overwhelming. So it's just something to have a bit of a think about. And then I guess too, a question that can be useful to consider or reflect on is, if you're short on energy, if you've had a big day, do you always then try and desensitize yourself to try and push through? And if the answer is no, in certain situations, then maybe that's worth having a think about. So just talking a bit about sensory modulation and relating that back to trauma experience. So, and let's sort of talk about trauma and the senses. So something that's useful to consider or to keep in mind is that a person's sort of sensory preferences, so sensory likes and the sensory input that their system kind of needs and is wanting to engage in, is not always opposite to trauma triggers. So, for example, a person can be triggered by a particular scent, but that doesn't mean that they are sensitive to all scents. They may actually seek out and enjoy certain preferred scents. So you could use that example for sound. So a person, because of their trauma history, could be triggered by a particular sound, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily sensitive to all sounds. There might be certain preferred sounds that they quite like. So why Carolyn and I say that is that when we do sensory exploration and think about sort of our sensory needs, it does need to be considered and acknowledged that there could be a possible presence of trauma, and there could be a trauma trigger. And, obviously we need to be respectful and mindful of this. I just wanted to also mention this concept of neuroception, which some people are aware of. It's, I guess, a concept that that they talk about in polyvagal theory, which is a theory that has some really interesting aspects and helps to explain the nervous system's response to trauma. But neuroception is a really good concept to be aware of, and it is basically the unconscious perception of danger or threat in the environment, and our neuroception response then elicits a defense response in our system, and that defense response is automatic. We don't have control over that. So, for example, a defense response could be that we, fight the potential threat, we run away from the potential threat, we freeze and sort of freeze up or find it difficult to move and interact in that environment, or we might shut down, just as some examples. So those responses are automatic. We don't have control over them. And sometimes people will flip or sort of shift between different unconscious responses as well. So how can trauma experience impact on an activity like self-care, for example, an activity like showering? So I think trauma can impact on showering in a number of ways. So obviously there can be, if someone is showering, there can be certain sensory input that person is experiencing in that activity that can set off a trauma trigger, or can elicit a flashback, or can activate that sort of panic response. People with trauma experience could also experience sensory overload, which can then lead to something like, where your system, where your mind and body kind of shuts down, or you experience dissociative and dissociative sort of symptoms. Trauma can also, in an activity like showering, can also impact on our executive functioning. So if we are experiencing a sensory trigger, or a trauma trigger in a shower, then that can make it really hard to reach into our thinking part of our brain. So it can sort of sometimes feel like that executive functioning, that thinking and that problem solving and that quick memory recall and that judgment can be kind of almost offline. It's really hard to reach that sort of functioning. And then a person could also, with trauma experience in that sort of showering task, could have difficulty with their reading and registering those interoceptive cues, so those internal bodily sensory input that gives us information about how we're feeling and our emotions. So just to go through a few concepts too that relate to this. So I've started to talk about this idea of sensory triggers. So a sensory trigger is a sensation reminder of difficult bad memories. Or a sensory trigger could also be a sensory processing difficulty. So a sensory trigger could relate to a trauma, so it can be indicative of a trauma or relate to a trauma experience, or it could be reflective of sensory processing or difficulty like sensory sensitivity. A sensory trigger can, of course, also connect to a thought, and that can contribute or lead to higher levels of anxiety and flashbacks and dissociations as well. And so when we're thinking about sensory triggers or trauma triggers, Carolyn and I will also just remind people, and I'm sure you guys are well aware of this, but that we don't need to know, when we're sort of starting to explore or curiously understand a person's sensory triggers, we don't need to know the details of why it's a sensory trigger. or a trauma trigger. It's helpful to know what, but we don't need to know why. And that can be detail can be respectfully avoided unless the person has an interest and would like to discuss that with someone. But if they, we don't need to know that information. So I mentioned this concept of sensory overload. So this is where a person might experience too much sensory input, or too much sound, too much light, too much movement, too much smell, too much touch. And so it can be too much of that sensory input, or it could be too much of one or two particular sensory inputs if that person has really heightened sensory sensitivity for that sensory input. And so experiencing sensory overload, or sometimes it's referred to as sensory overwhelm, can obviously feel like, the world is kind of attacking you. It can feel really distressing and really traumatic, and people can, again, go into that sort of shutdown mode. They might go into a bit of fight and flight, but they might also go into shutdown mode. And I think if people don't understand that a person experiences sensory overload, or if the person themselves doesn't understand that, it can be really invalidating and confusing as to sort of why you're feeling that way, why you feel like you're shutting down and you have no control of that. So it can be really, really difficult to navigate. Carolyn and I feel that there's a lot of presentations that can be explained by potentially sensory overload. So if we think about people who have dementia or intellectual disability, there's often the term used, sundowning, where people need sort of in the afternoon, like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can sometimes see people are more distressed, more unsettled. Maybe there's more incidents of people kind of wandering or yelling or exhibiting those behaviours. And so Carolyn and I feel that this concept of sensory overload could really explain that presentation. You think about babies and the witching hour. Again, that could be a situation where there's just been a build-up of sensory input over a period of time, and just by the afternoon, that baby's nervous system is just frazzled, it's just unsettled. You see that sometimes with kids, who have had a really big day at school and they've kind of held it together at school, and as soon as they get home, it unleashes because their nervous system is just overflowing. There's just, they've had too much sensory input, and, they're really struggling and need some time to sort of calm down. So we've talked about sensory triggers and trauma triggers. So in helping us identify trauma triggers, so a trauma trigger could be sensory input that a person really dislikes, really hates, is really aversive for them. It could be linked to things like a particular person, a place, a certain age, a date, a time of year, a season. So there could be that connection to those sorts of anchors, I guess. It could be a person might be quite aware of what their trauma trigger is, or they might not be. It could be just something that sort of feels like it's really automatic, and they haven't made that connection yet. It could be, so it could be something that the person identifies, I really hate that, I don't want that, I don't want to have that, I don't want to go into that, or I don't want that input. Or they may identify it specifically, they've made the connection and it's a trauma, they know it's a trauma trigger. And again, we don't necessarily need to know the details of why it's a trigger, just that it might be one. And just mindful to know that a self-care step or a task or a component of a self-care task could actually be contain a sensory or a trauma trigger. So what sort of problematic sensory input might people have or experience when we're looking at a self-care task like showering? So a person might find certain smells problematic. So it could be the smells of the toilet, it could be the cleaning products, or it could be, other products that are used in the bathroom. There could be problematic sound input. So it could be echoes in a bathroom, with all the tiles. There can be sort of not just sounds, but echoes of sounds. It could be the sound of the pipes kind of groaning. It could be the squeaking of the taps. It could be the sound of the water going through the shower head. It could be sounds going on outside of the bathroom that might be distressing. If we think about touch sensory input, it could be the pressure of the water coming through the shower head. It could be the temperature, or that maybe the temperature is hard to get right, or it changes a lot and you have to kind of constantly adapt it. It could be the difference between sort of the temperature of the water but then the cold air around you. It could be the touch or the temperature of the towel. It could of the tile, or it could be the texture of the towel. If we're looking at proprioceptive input, so that's sort of that proprioception as a sensory input is our understanding and awareness of our body's position in space without our visual input. And so we have lots of proprioceptive receptors in our muscles and in our joints and in our tendons. And so we can set off, I guess, our proprioceptive receptors by moving and by sort of providing deep pressure input. So, contracting our muscles against resistance. So for some people, maybe there's not enough deep pressure input when they're showering. Or maybe there's the touch of water pressure is too intense. So for vestibular input, so that's like movement, our movement sensory system. So maybe for some people, being in the shower and being still, there's not enough movement. They feel sort of a bit contained in that environment. Or potentially, if someone is very vestibular sensitive, they might get really dizzy if they're changing positions, having to reach down to wash different parts of themselves and move their body around. For interoception, there could be intense cues in that shower environment, or a person might be missing those cues. And so I guess there just could be specific within that showering environment and activity. There might be very particular trauma reminders that sort of trigger a sort of a trauma response. So if someone is sensory sensitive, there might be specific sensations that they really find difficult, or there just might be too many sensations in a showering activity. And for people that are sensory seeking of sensory input, maybe the input is too boring or not novel enough, not variable enough for them. So to help try and identify, because that's a lot of different sensory input in just one self-care task, isn't it, of showering. So how do we try and help identify what sensory input might be problematic for a person? And so that's where a document like this can come in handy. This is just called the Sensory Input in the Environment worksheet. And this worksheet's actually available for free on our website, Sensory Modulation Brisbane, if people would like to use that moving forward. We can review the environment by just looking through, and some of these questions might relate, but some of them might not. But it gives people a bit of a way of starting to ask those questions and starting to think about the different sensory input. So this can be useful, to document too, maybe the different times of day and different sensations in the environment. And there might be specific sensations that are difficult for someone, or it might be just the fact that there's lots of sensations that person's going into that overload mode. And you can, I would definitely encourage you to ask the person to be, obviously involved and actively contribute to this, but you would do it when the person is not feeling distressed, when they're feeling more at ease and relaxed. And you can ask trusted other people to be involved in completing the worksheet. So let's get on to some sensory modulation strategies for that can be useful for showering. So I've divided this into 3 different tips. So tip 1, or step 1, is what we've been talking about, trying to identify the sensory contributors to difficulties in showering. So we can, and something like the sensory input in the environment worksheet can be really helpful for that. So asking or thinking about, are there any sounds, sights, smells, or touch that you hate, that you dislike, that you're sensitive to, that you avoid, that remind you of the past or of negative things or unpleasant things? Is there, and you could ask, is there anything that bothers you about showering? Is there a step in that showering task that really bothers you? So again, we don't need the backstory. We don't need to know why, just what might be problematic. And sometimes people will ask, well, how do I know if it's a trauma trigger? How do I know if I just really dislike it? How do I know if it's sort of sensory sensitivity, a sensory trigger? And Carolyn and I would say, does it really matter whether it's one of those things or all of those things? What we know when we work with people is that those things can really impact on a person's ability to engage in a self-care task like showering. So whether it's one or two or the other probably doesn't matter. It's about identifying what's problematic and then coming up with some strategies to help navigate the activity. So step 2 is, once we've identified what could be, and I guess we're being a bit of a sensory detective in doing that, once we identify what could be some problematic sensory input, then we could use or trial some sensory modulation strategies to change that sensory input, therefore to change how we feel, to help us with showering or with bathing. So I've just listed some examples here. So if a person is feeling anxious before the shower, then we could use some calming sensory input and some safe sensory input to help them sort of feel more calm and feel more at ease. If the issue might be the smell of the toilet, we could use different products. We could use this great stuff called Poo-Pourri, which you can buy online, or there's lots of make your own options there that help to sort of trap smell, and then you sort of, when you flush it, it flushes all away. If a person's feeling vulnerable because they're not clothed or they're naked, and that's a trigger for them, could you use towels in the shower? Could you use like a wrap, like made out of cheesecloth? Could you wear clothes in the shower? Could you wear togs in the shower? If you're still having a shower, but putting something over you while you're showering helps you feel more safe and less vulnerable, maybe that's an option. Is it the sound of the shower head? Could you look at changing the shower head to make it sound different? Could you use waterproof earplugs? Could you use, could you have music playing in the bathroom to try and sort of drown that sound out? If it's the feeling of the water, again, the pressure of it, could you change the shower head, or could you alternate or instead have a bath, which maybe addresses that sensation? If it's because you're feeling dizzy or unsteady on your feet, could you sit down on a shower chair? Could you have a bath instead? If the sensory input's not enough in the shower, if it's boring, could you change the products around so there's different smells and different textures? Could you add some different inputs? So play some music or have a loofah instead of, to sort of rub on your skin. If the temperature of the water is really difficult to get right, then could you preset the temperature? And if it's a vulnerability thing, again, you're really frightened of someone walking in, could you lock the door? Could you have a door jamb? Could you have an opaque shower curtain? Could you have a wrap or wear clothes when you're showering? And then step 3 is looking at using a sensory modulation accommodations. So this is where we would focus on changing potentially or considering changing the occupation, the environment or the person to improve that participation in self-care. So if we're thinking about the person, we might, this is a bit of a summary here, I guess, but we might try and dial down problematic sensory input if we can. We might change sensory input, or we might add in some preferred sensory input. If we're thinking about occupations or activities, we might be able to identify problematic parts or the problematic part of the self-care task and try and modify that, do it differently, accommodate that. Or you might want to change the task completely. So still getting the same outcome, but doing it in a different way. And then if it's the environment, you might want to change the bathroom environment. Are there things that you could change to make that environment different? Or could you actually not do that activity in that environment? Could you do a bucket bath in another room, for example? And this is just a neat slide that shows about this idea of if there are, if undertaking all of the tasks of a shower can be overwhelming because of that sensory sensitivity. Could the task be broken into steps and then you use different strategies within those steps? So for example, you know, to wash your face, maybe you know, splash it from the sink or use a face washer. Some people find washing their body and their hair in the same activity is really difficult because that sensation of the hair dripping over their body is really problematic. So you might want to break up that task, for example. So that's all the slides, except, and before we go on to the prepared questions, I just wanted to point people, I mentioned our website, Sensory Modulation Brisbane. We do have different resources on Sensory Modulation Brisbane. These are some examples of some on-demand training that we do. We offer really good discounts for, you know, families and for NDIS participants, or you know, people living with BPD. So you know, if people are interested, that's there. We, on our website too, we have a huge number of free resources as well, and you're welcome to use all of those and to go through that. This is an example of some of our free resources that you can just download and use at any time. But are people happy for me to go through some of the questions that I've been sent? Is that okay? Have we got a few minutes to do that?
That'll be great, Julie.
Excellent, excellent.
And there's also another question here on the chat too, when you get through.
Okay, great. Well, and I'd just like to say thank you so much for sending through the questions. They are great questions, and I was really glad I got them yesterday so I could really reflect on them and have a bit of a think. So I'll just go through them if that's okay, and one by one. So the first question is, which was a great question, and I'm going to try and answer it as best I can, and I hope I don't disappoint the person who asked it, because it's a great question. Have you discovered a link between sensory integration dysfunction in childhood and BPD? Have any papers been written on this topic? So look, this is by no means necessarily that there are no papers written on that topic. I am not aware of any particular papers that make that, or research that makes that link. However, there are plenty of research and papers that draw links between sensory processing differences, trauma experience, and borderline personality disorder. So I've sort of started, you know, at the beginning of the presentation where I talked about the different sensory profiles and how that a person with BPD might experience some of those, you know, sort of sensory missing, sensory sensitivity, you know, sensory avoidance, and etc. So there's definitely research that talks about that. And I think, but it's also really important to keep in mind that people's sensory processing patterns are unique. So we can see trends, of course, but it's not one size fits all. And our sensory processing patterns can be from childhood. So, you know, people that have sensory sensitivities tend to, or a large group of people that have sensory sensitivity, for example, will have that from childhood. But the caveat to that, of course, is that different things can impact on those patterns. So aging can impact on sensory processing. Health issues can impact on sensory processing, and trauma can impact on sensory processing. So I guess just to give you a little bit of information about some of the researched sensory processing patterns that have been sort of talked about in the literature. So, so people with BPD do present with sensory processing and sensory modulation patterns. So, for example, and this is a generalization, but just to give people an example. So, increased sensory sensitive and sensory avoiding sensory profile patterns. And so that's what contributes to that, I guess, experience of sensory overload. Sensitivity to smell, sound, light touch, food textures, temperature, light, visual movement, and vestibular. So there's some research that talks about people with BPD can actually have high levels of motion sickness, which is quite interesting. People with BPD can often have reduced auditory sensory gating. So when I talked about when people have repeated exposure to sensory input that they're sensitive to or that they tend to avoid, they don't get used to that. They just tolerate it. You know, that repeated exposure doesn't mean that people's systems start to get used to that sensory input and they're less sensory sensitive. What it can often happen is a person just tolerates it, they mask it, and then sometimes that can then lead to that sensory overload. People can also experience reduced body awareness and increased body dissociation. So I think that can reflect difficulty with interoceptive cues, and possibly, I think, potentially some people can be missing proprioceptive cues, proprioceptive input, and that might explain why sometimes people with BPD tend to seek out that deep pressure, that proprioceptive input. Again, that's sort of a generalization though. There is research that talks about reduced pain sensitivity for people with BPD, and that can contribute then to medical issues going undiagnosed or late to be diagnosed, like persistent pain, endometriosis, and fibromyalgia as examples. People can, BPD people can have increased seeking to certain movement input. So they can seek out and want certain movement sensory input, certain proprioceptive sensory input, and deep touch. And we talked about missing interoceptive cues. So so I could go on, and there is lots of research about that connection between sensory processing and borderline personality disorder. There is some really interesting research too about co-occurrence of borderline personality disorder and autism, and co-occurrence of autism and eating disorders. So that's sort of interesting as well. There was another one that I thought was really good. So there was a review that was done in 2009 looking at personality disorders and sensory processing, and that study that was done in the UK demonstrated higher levels of sensory sensitivity and sensory avoidance. Again, people with personality disorder. So hopefully that doesn't entirely answer your question, but it gives you definitely that connection between sensory processing and borderline personality disorder. So I had a really interesting question. Can you give an indication whether wanting to be rid of all body hair, and this is for in respect to a heterosexual male, is part of the BPD experience? What a fantastic question. So I did have a think about that, and I think, look, you know, there could be many, like a lot of people's experiences, there could be many explanations, right? But if I put my sensory detective hat on, or my sensory lens, what I thought, it could be reflective of sensory sensitivity to light touch, or an aversion, you know, to that feeling of hair. So how it feels on your skin, how it feels when you're sweaty, and, you know, that because that can change that sensation when you're maybe hot and sweaty and the hair is kind of collecting the sweat, or the sensation of when it's cold and those hair follicles kind of stiffen up and you get that, that sensation of everything tightening. Or perhaps it's an aversion to the sensation of the hair touching clothing. So, when we put on clothes and wear clothes. So again, with sensory sensitivity to light touch, and a great example that I often talk about is, where you have a tag in your clothes. And so some people, they'll put on their shirt and they'll feel that tag and they'll, I don't like, that's right, I remember when I wear this shirt, I don't like that tag. But within a couple of minutes, their brain tunes it out. If someone's sensory sensitive, they will feel that tag all day, and their brain will just go tag, 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 tag. So potentially that hair on that person, if then that hair, that they don't like, they've got that sensory sensitivity, that feeling, or the feeling of when the hair is touching the clothing and the sensory input that's providing. So that could be reflective of light touch sensitivity, and perhaps that feeling of smoothness is preferred, and it reduces some of that sensory input. So there, that was my sensory detective kind of analysis of that. So I hope that makes sense. Third question was, my daughter has the same difficulty with brushing her teeth. I assume these two might be related. What are your thoughts? And there was another question, do you have any advice for brushing teeth? Look, I would suggest you think about the same 3 steps that I went through in the webinar. So first of all, I'd think about what are the potential sensory components of brushing teeth that person might find problematic. Is it the light touch? Is it the deep touch of the toothbrush? Is it that she's touching different parts of her mouth and there's different pressure variants, so you might brush kind of harder and brush softer? Is it that brushing your own teeth, there's a degree of, if we're not controlling beautifully the pressure and keeping it even all the time, there might be like a lack of predictability with that pressure. So, and that can be really unsettling for people, so it's like sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's soft, and then it's hard to predict that. Could it be the sound, the taste that go on in your mouth? So the taste of the toothpaste. If people have gingivitis, they might get blood, from brushing their gums, and then you sort of taste the blood and they don't like, or they spit out, the toothpaste and they see the blood, and that's really, really distressing. It could be the different textures. So again, the texture of the brush. There's so many taste textures too, so there's, when you first start brushing your teeth, the toothpaste might be a little bit more congealed, and then as the saliva gets added, there's more frothy sort of toothpaste, and so there's that sort of transition of different textures in our mouth. The feeling of having your mouth open for a period of time, maybe that's triggering or distressing for some people. The sound of teeth cleaning, so the sound, what it sounds like in your mouth, or the sound of the electric toothbrush, or it could be elements of sensory input in the room that you're brushing your teeth. So in the bathroom, so is it the echoes in the bathroom? Is it the light in the bathroom? Is it the noise in the bathroom? So lots of, it's amazing when you break it down how much sensory input there can be in a 2-minute, a 2-minute activity. So then I would also think about so as I mentioned, where the teeth cleaning is happening. Could there be any sort of sensory or trauma triggers in the environment? So it might not necessarily be all about the feeling of, or the sensory input from cleaning the teeth. It might be the environment that the person's doing the cleaning. You could also think about the time of day. So are people find it easier to clean their teeth in the morning, but they find it hard at night, and maybe that could reflect that overload. It's just so much input that a person's had over the day, and they're tired and they're wanting to get to bed, and just from a nervous system perspective, they're done. There's just too much. It's just, so they might be avoiding teeth cleaning because it's too big a sensory task for them to achieve at that time of night. You could think about preferences regarding, so we're starting to sort of get into strategies now. So start thinking about preferences about the brush that the person's using. So would it be better to have a hand brush that's really soft, or would it be better to have an electric toothbrush that is more even and predictable? You could look at preferences in regarding to the location of where a person cleans the teeth, the timing of it. You could look at could there be some competing sensory input to block out or to sort of distract the brain from difficult sensory input? Or if we're talking about predictability, some people, when they're feeling really having difficulty with the sensory input, it can often, because they're feeling a bit overwhelmed, it can feel like, even though it's maybe for 2 minutes or 3 minutes, it can feel like that task goes on forever and there's no sense of when that task finishes. So potentially could a timer be used? Or you could say, clean your teeth until the end of this song, or we'll put the timer on and when the timer ends, or, you know, look at the clock and, you know, when it gets to the 12, then we're done with the task. So then that's adding in a bit of predictability, and that might be sufficient to get that person to feel like, okay, I've only got 10 seconds left, or I've only got 20 seconds left, and that can help with the task sometimes. Could you use safe sensory input to help increase feelings of sensory ease and felt safety? And for times when the person is overloaded and it might just be a bridge too far, can there be an alternative? And probably the dentists in the world are going to be shocked and howl at the moon for that, but for occasionally, you know, could you use a water flosser? You know, maybe that might be a preferred sensation to brushing when a person is in overload. Could you use mouthwash? Could you just put some toothpaste on your finger and kind of put it around and then swish it around, and at least then there's, you know, for that alternative, that might do sometimes. So they were just some ideas that I guess I came up with, and I hope that answers some of your questions, or just gives you some ideas to consider with supporting your daughter, and all the best with that. I hope some of those are useful.
Wonderful presentation,
Yeah.
Julie. There's one more in the chat by Buffy. Can you grow your stockpile of spoons that you were talking about earlier?
That's a really good question too. So some people will say that there are spoon increasing potentially, and because this is a theory, so I guess you know, people can add or minus things to the theory. But certainly some people will say, are there spoon growing activities? You know, can I increase my spoons? I mean, certainly, you know, I think that it would be great to do those things together, wouldn't it? So trying to conserve spoons and do things for sensory ease, but if there's opportunities to build spoons, you know, that can be great as well. I think sometimes the building of spoons is like the long-term building. So any activity uses a spoon, right? If you follow the theory, and people can agree or disagree with this because it's just a theory, but any engagement in an activity will use some sort of energy, some sort of spoon. Even sleeping uses spoons. But good sleep over a period of time does grow our spoons. You know, it helps us restore and rebalance and things. So short answer, yes. How we grow our spoons is probably different for different people. I think things that help us feel calmer, help us feel more connected, help give us feelings of joy and pleasure, I guess, or ease, they would probably be more likely to help us in the long run grow spoons. But I don't know if it's as transactional as I can do this one thing and that's got me 5 more spoons for the day. It's more of an accumulative thing, if that makes sense.
Wow, fabulous.
That would
Thank
be
you
how
so
I
much,
would see it
Julie.
anyway, but other people might have different opinions to that. Would you like, there's a few other things I can go through if people have got 5 more minutes.
Yeah, well, people are not leaving, Julie, so
Okay, I'll just keep talking if that's okay. So there was a question. I would like some advice on the topic from a partner point of view rather than from a parent. I do hope that the way that I've presented that information is translatable, whether a person is you know, a parent or a family member or a partner or a sister or brother. So I hope that, yeah, that's been helpful for that person. And there was also a question about, I would like to understand sensory processing for the person with BPD. So I hope that the information that I've shared in the presentation and then also at the Q&A has helped provide a little bit more of that information for you. There was a question about, my daughter is triggered by showering because a serious health attempt kind of happened in the shower, and numerous self-harm occurred in the bathroom. She always tries to avoid showering if possible. She's tried different bathrooms, but the triggers still occur. And so this her parent was wondering if she needs to teach strategies to cope with the triggers. So I'd say, first of all, I'm really sorry that your daughter has experienced this. That must be really distressing for her and for, you know, family members to try and help her and support her. So, you know, I'm sorry that that's her experience. So again, probably some points that I would make is that it could be still helpful to respectfully and supportively and in a trauma-informed way, as I discussed in the webinar, help your daughter with her understanding about what she feels the triggers are. You know, so yes, I'm triggered, but what might be some of that sort of sensory input that is contributing or that's problematic for the person that could be triggering you. And so again, you could maybe use that you know, sensory input in the environment handout as a kind of just a way of getting that conversation started, to help sort of go through some of those different sensory systems and sort of, you know, unpack it a bit. The other thing I thought is it would be useful to curiously get a sense of, and respectfully, obviously, that is your daughter experiencing the triggers, or is part of it avoiding the environment to prevent the experience of the triggers? So I think that can just be useful to, and it could be both. It doesn't necessarily need to be one or the other, but I think it might be useful just to get a sense of, is it that these triggers are always happening, or are we getting to a point where the person is worried and fearful that those triggers will happen, and so therefore their coping strategies to avoid that environment. So that can be useful, because then there can be different strategies to help cope with the potential sensory triggers, or, you know, the triggers of the experience, but also cope with the person's anxiety and feelings of lack of safety and unease. So trying to, as we've sort of talked before, trying to work out how to reduce the occurrence of the triggers, trying to increase safe sensory input for the person, sometimes trying to create more predictability with the safe sensory input. So if we can dial down the input that's problematic and distressing, and dial up the sort of input that's safe and soothing, or, you know, is calming for the person, then that's going to help. So we talked about predictability. That can help the brain reboot, I guess, and start to consider that, okay, when I do this activity, that trigger doesn't necessarily have to happen every time. And that's a sort of a gentle, supportive work in progress. And look, maybe in the meantime, because that can take time and trying different things, and maybe in the meantime, could some of the bathing sometimes be performed differently as well, so that person gets a little bit of a break from some of those environments that she finds so distressing. So some of those ideas that we've talked about in the presentation as well. So hopefully that's a few sort of ideas to consider and think about. We had an interesting question. When a BPD person is overweight and this impacts them getting in the shower as well, they like it when they get in there, yet avoid it. So it's almost that sort of anticipatory kind of avoidance, you know, and taking ages to get in. And then once they're in the water or in the shower, there's elements of that they really like. And so I think, yes, that could definitely be a factor. But again, if I use my sensory detective or my sensory lens, I would say, yes, that could be a body image issue, or from a sensory perspective, and it doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be either or, it could be in addition as well. It could be to do with the sensation of being without clothes, or the sensation of water touching bare skin. And that can feel really exposing and really it can make a person feel really vulnerable, potentially, depending on what their circumstances are. So, you know, again, that might go back to, could doing the shower a little bit differently? Could the shower be done wearing some clothes, wearing underwear, wearing a bathing suit, wearing a cheesecloth muumuu? I mean, you think about ancient Rome and Greece, people had baths wearing clothes. You know, they wore them over the top. You know, again, it's doing the shower a bit differently, but if that helps a person feel less exposed and they're still showering and cleaning themselves, you know, maybe that's a solution to consider. And then the final question, lucky last, would be interested to hear about coexisting eating disorder issues, because they can sort of increase that complication or the complexity of a person's presentation. And I would say yes, though, as I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, there's expanding literature on research around sensory processing issues for people with eating disorders, and you know, research that talks about higher rates of people with autism that have eating disorders. And you know, autism is a sensory processing condition, so there's absolutely connections there. And so, as we mentioned, that those interoceptive differences, so having reduced interoceptive awareness. So, you know, for example, that means that people's cues for hunger can be different. Their feelings of cessation and fullness can be different. Their connection and awareness of their body and how that feels, and the information that sends us to help us with our emotions. So then being able to read and understand emotional signals and regulate our emotions can be really impacted. And there is some research that talks about people with eating disorders having heightened sensory sensitivities to some input and avoidance, and missing some sensory cues. So yeah, absolutely, definitely connection, and it can really impact. And I think more, and I would hope that, and I have heard for sort of innovative eating disorder programs and supports will acknowledge sensory processing and use sensory modulation strategies for people with eating disorders. And really, it's about sort of tailoring those strategies to their needs.
Oh, thank you, Julie. I'm mindful of the time, so I don't want to take people any further longer, but it's interesting because there's actually been quite some research in the area of autism, which you say there's quite a bit of comorbidity and overlap, that apparently there's autistic, the condition has been found to be associated with anywhere up to 50% more synapses, which contributes to in their brain, which contributes to that sensory overload. So it'd be quite interesting whether that extends to other neurological conditions like potentially BPD. I know that BPD is sort of like not, you know, whether it's formally or not formally in the neurodivergent space.
Yeah.
But that 40% or whatever, even you know, X% of more synapses.
Yes. Well, look, I think without a doubt there's connections and correlations and commonalities. And if people are really interested in the neuroscience, so I talked about predictive processing as sort of a contemporary, well, it's been around for 20 plus years, but it's just gathering more momentum as a model or a theory of how the brain works. And it does explain so much of certain presentations and symptoms. It's just fascinating, and it gives us also some insights into strategies that we can use, and sensory modulation kind of fits in beautifully there. So, but the other, and we do have a course on that if people are obsessed with that like I am. But there's also another, when we're thinking about the brain and different parts of the brain that do things, now more contemporary ways of looking at the brain and understanding the processes is by, rather than thinking about discrete areas like, and I mean, this is obviously discrete areas are important, like the cerebellum and the amygdala and the thalamus and all that sort of stuff, but to actually think about the functional brain networks, because the brain is really like, a big train network where there's lots of stations, but there's lots of links and connections to all from that connects all those stations. So just looking at the stations isn't enough. We've got to look at the connections and how those connections impact. So that's where we look at sort of those functional brain networks. So if you go on Science Direct and all those wonderful things that send you wonderful research, new research articles, they all talk about functional connectivity and functional brain networks. And so that's really where I think we can build our understanding of the kind of the practical and functional impact of brains and how they work on how we experience life and our functioning. So I think that's where more research is going and where it's really interesting.
Wonderful. I could listen to you all night, Julie. So thank you. I love your analogy, especially about being a sensory detective and asking lots of questions to unpack what is causing this particular, loved one person's avoiding behaviour to find effective strategy. So thank you, Julie. Very insightful presentation. Thank you.
And what a privilege. Thank you so much for asking me here. And I hope that's been helpful. And feel free to go on our website. We've got Facebook pages. I think on the slides there's all the sort of ways that you can contact us. And we try to post lots of things, lots of interesting things and blogs and all that sort of stuff. So welcome people to join if they're interested to learn more.
Excellent. And of course, we will be posting this also on our website. So stay tuned. So thank you, Julie. I'll stay to say goodbye to you while everyone leaves. So, but thank you guys for coming on board and listening to Julie present. I if you're like me, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I could have listened to some more, especially about the cognitive neuroscience behind a lot of this stuff. Thank you, guys. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone.